a bit and really enjoyed it. More so than the original board game, surprisingly enough.
See, I've never played Rivals. I played the original card game a number of times, but I have too many two-player games and not enough time. So.
And in fact, Joe has designed a game that could be described as a Settler spinoff. You might ask him about that later on.
Really, Joe?
Yep.
But not an expansion. Wouldn't be an expansion to Catan.
It's on BGG. It would not be hard to figure it out with a very small amount of detective work.
I'm not a good detective, though.
You wouldn't have to be.
Joe loves setting these little puzzles for everybody, like making a geek list without a title.
Yes. A number of those. Takes a little work. He doesn't want it to be that easy to find his geek list.
Of course. Yeah. Why would you want anybody to see your geek list?
Exactly.
Especially one that seems so just like, when I finally found it, I was like, oh, this is Joe Huber kind of making his own geek list just for himself. And this is becoming weirdly viral.
I do not explain. I do not try and explain or understand why things work. Most of my geek lists are set so that they don't show up on the front page, so that they don't cause such problems.
I appreciate that. I can relate. I'm just looking up all the spin-offs and stuff. Yeah, there's been a lot of spin-offs of Catan, haven't there? That's pretty. Oh, yeah. And even like a movie. You're right, Joe. There's like a movie. Wow. This is going to be a very good podcast. I'm very much looking forward to this.
Very cool. Yeah, and really, whenever we're ready, TC, you could do sort of a countdown. Are Eric and Joe, is there anything specific, anything clawing at you here? I've already started the recording, so TC, I felt like the stuff that we said about 5 minutes ago, I almost wanted to give TC the option to like use that, and I'm like, oh, why aren't we recording? So
I'm going to use it.
Well, it's in if you think they're helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, since I pressed record, I feel like we kind of got back to just, like just kind of back to banter. But like some of those things that you were saying about it, I was like, man, why didn't I press record here? So I'm, of course, doing the detective work because that's what we do. And I see Starship Merchants, which at least is a suspect in this ongoing unraveling mystery of the game by Joe Huber. It looks like Tom Lehman also designed that one with you.
That's a spin-off of a different favorite game of Joe, which is
Race for the Galaxy.
Which is a 18XX game, where XX equals 238.
Ah, yes, 2038.
2038 without the stock and without the map.
Interesting.
But it's not Settlers spin-off.
Yes, it has nothing to do with Settlers. Or with Starship Catan, or with Starfarers.
Well, I have a finite list.
English games.
I can say them all. Let's see here. I'm going to guess it's neither of the Chattanooga Choo-Choos. Those seem like that would be. I'm going to pass up Ice Cream, Joust, Life of the Party sounds like a party game. Lone Sevens, Scream Machine, Transportation Tricks, Burger Joints.
Maybe we'll do the big reveal later.
Production where a player draws cubes from a bag, and then players trade and use. Yeah, it's Burger Joint, isn't it?
It is Burger Joint.
Bum bum bum. Okie dokie.
Joe wins the prize.
To 12 victory points wins. Yeah, where's my prize? Where's my? I want a burger. I want it like that Shaq movie.
I think that's the longest road.
Right now, if you built the longest road, it would be. I would probably be on it, but it would be definitely connecting TC and the two of you, gentlemen.
When he mentioned it, and then when you discovered, I think technically that's the winner for the longest road there, Joe. Oh,
All right. Well,
so we've got. Let me make sure I get this right before I start putting my foot in my mouth, which I'm really good at doing. We've got. It's Eric Brosius.
Yep.
Okay, and Joe Huber, right?
You got it.
All right. So make sure I'm pronouncing it because this is going to be interesting because we have two Joes. And last time we had a podcast with two Joes, things got really, really interesting.
Yeah, when somebody says Joe, I will sometimes be like, "Oh, you're talking to me," and in this podcast, you will not be talking to me. You'll be wanting to hear from other Joes. So, yeah.
Good Joe and other
games with two Joes, so we're used to it.
Okay.
You need to muscle your way through. So we have Adam joining us in the chat. So good to hear from you, Adam. And we are going to be starting here in just a minute. So if you think of anything to ask and pick the brains of Eric and Joe, share them there in the chat. I'll try to keep checking it momentarily.
All right. Are we ready, gentlemen?
Ready.
All right. I'll give the countdown and we will proceed. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Welcome to a new episode of the Longview Podcast, where we take a closer look at the games people play. The Longview Podcast is sponsored by Game Surplus. Yes, go to Game Surplus with Carmen and Elaine. Then there have been a lot of additions on there that I've been wanting to pull the trigger on that my wife has been keeping me from doing because we have a finite amount of money with school coming up with our kids. We do have a nice little code that you can use that Joe always throw Joe under the bus here to tell our listeners to, because it's always fun to do. Joe, what is our code for the Longview Podcast discount? Joe? Hello?
I do not remember the Longview Podcast. Responsibility-wise, that is your responsibility.
See, this is why I like doing it. I love it.
Throwing me under the bus. I'm pretty sure it's like the Longview picks or just Longview picks. It's in one of your transitions. Dude.
And no, it's not. My daughter says it at the beginning of I put a bumper at the beginning, but I just love putting you on the spotlight, Joe. It's just like this running joke that I never get tired of.
The Longview Podcast promo code is Good Board Ugly Picks. Good Board Ugly Picks.
Close enough. Close enough. Well, in this episode, I am really excited because me and what we now refer to as we'll call our guests. We got our guests here. We have Good Joe. We have Eric Brosius and Good Joe Huber. We are going to this. You're Bad Joe. We have Good Joe and Bad Joe. I have officially made the designation. We are going to be discussing one of the cornerstones in our industry. We are going to be discussing the classic board game Settlers of Catan, or as I think it's referred to now as Catan. So joining me, of course, we have Eric Brosius. You may say hello, Eric.
Hello.
Hello, yes, and we have Good Joe. Say hi, Good Joe.
Hi, Good Joe.
All right. Good Joe. Hopefully, if we get some of this banter going, made Bad Joe run some loops to find a game on Board Game Geek, and it was absolutely awesome. So yes, we're going to be talking Settlers of Catan. I think this is going to be, like I said, it's widely considered one of the evergreen titles of the industry. In fact, it is very much associated with the revival of the board game industry in general. Hey, Eric, which one of you two guys want to discuss what Catan is? Eric or Good Joe?
I think I will give a description of the game, and then Joe can give a description of how he came across it and the historical background.
I like this idea. Please proceed.
So, Settlers, as I call it, you're right, they changed the name to Catan probably to make it more multilingual, but I still call it Settlers, which, makes it hard to look up on Board Game Geek because if you type in, you don't actually get the game anymore, but I'm stubborn that way. Settlers is a game designed by Klaus Teuber that combines two components. The first component is a board with hexagons. The hexagons have different types of terrain on them, forests, wheat fields, and so forth. And the players place wooden pieces of their colors on that board. So they start the game with a few little settlements and a few startings of roads. And Then you roll dice. Each player rolls the dice on their turn, and the hexes have numbers on them, and the hexes whose numbers are rolled on the dice generate resources. Those resources are in the form of cards, which the players who have settlements or later in the game cities next to those hexes receive. And those resources can then be used in order to build more settlements, to upgrade settlements to cities, to extend your roads, to buy cards, and to do various things that are going to help you to win. The winner of the game is going to be the person who gets to 10 victory points first. But the other part of the game is the trading aspect, because each player is going to have their settlements and cities near certain types of resources and probably not near other types of resources. Or if you are near other types of resources, it might be numbers like 2 or 3 or 11 or 12 that are not very often rolled. So if it takes a brick and a wood and a wheat and a sheep in order to build a settlement, you might have several of those components, but you don't have the others. So the other part of the game is free-form trading between the person whose turn it is and the other players. And I could say to Joe, I need a wood. Could you trade me a wood? And Joe could say, well, if you have a wheat, I will trade you a wood for a wheat. Or Joe might think, I need a better deal than that. I'll trade you a wood, but I need a wheat and a sheep. And if we agree, we trade those cards, and perhaps that's going to allow me to build the thing that I wanted to build. An important additional factor is that whenever a 7 is rolled, anyone who has more than 7 cards in their hand has to discard half of their hand rounded down. And so if you simply build up a ton of cards waiting for the perfect set to show up, you're going to keep losing cards when 7s are rolled. So I'm under some time pressure to trade with people that have the things I need right now so I can build them right now and get my hand down to a manageable size. And, if it's my turn and I trade with Joe, I might be able to build something or at least make progress toward building something. But Joe hopefully has been collecting things that are going to let him make progress toward what he wants to build. And so to me, the really interesting feature of Settlers is the combination of this board play, which is the kind of play that we're used to in games, right? Collecting resources, building things with them. And the trading, which is something that's not implemented as well in any other game that I'm aware of. And so that's a brief description of it. I haven't described all the aspects, but that'll get me started. And Joe can talk about the history.
So I'm even more stubborn than Eric. I still refer to the game as Die Siedler von Catan.
The original
German name.
That's how I was introduced to the game. So Die Siedler von Catan was released in Germany in spring of 1995 and was an immediate hit, is really the only way to put it. So it was a hit in Germany. There were copies, a limited number of copies brought by Ray Pfeiffer to the Gathering of Friends, which sold out essentially immediately. There was an impromptu tournament for Die Siedler von Catan at the Gathering. And the game just kind of blossomed from there. I first had the chance to play the game later that summer, and then actually received a copy as a birthday present that year because my father was in London for work and stopped by Just Games back when that store was in business in London and bought a copy. And so I actually have a Spiel des Jahres logo copy of Die Siedler von Catan because of that. And it's a game that took off with everyone. So I played it with family, I played it with friends, I played it with my mother-in-law. It's something that anyone could play, and in 1995, everyone who knew someone who had a copy seemed to be playing it. It then was brought out in English essentially as quickly as they could by Mayfair, thanks to the efforts of Jay Tummelson, who was working at Mayfair at that time, and brought over not only Settlers but a few other popular German titles as well, including Modern Art. Was brought out in English. I believe the first English edition was published in '96, which made it more accessible, introduced it to more folks, and has continued to be a very big seller in both U.S., Germany, and many other countries since then.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but last I heard, this game, I mean, it's sold like, I think there were like 22 million copies sold. I think. I mean, it's huge. It has been a really big game.
I can't remember if it's 22 million copies of the base game or if it's 22 million copies of all of the Settlers products, but in either event, those numbers dwarf most anything that you see for hobby game numbers.
Staggering.
Yeah, and it was one, at least in my recollection, it was like one of the first German style Euro games that really broke out of Europe at that time. And
a huge tidal wave of a game. Mm-hmm. The way I got it was a little different than Joe. I was searching the internet for information about games back in the late 90s, not in 1995, but there was a Usenet group called rec.games.board, and people were mentioning it. And I decided to take a trip down to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where a woman named Carol Monica had a store named The Games People Play. Carol was a big influence in bringing games from Germany to the United States. And I purchased a copy of the Mayfair edition of Settlers from her. I think I might have paid $48 for that game, which was an enormous amount of money in 1996 or 1997, or whenever I got it. But this game, just like Joe said, I played it with my family. I played it with friends. My children at the time were fairly young. My son was too young to hold a hand of cards in his hand. So, to be fair, we all played with our commodity cards face up on the table. Of course, you have those other cards, the development cards, that were face down, but with the cards face up on the table, he could play. And I helped the younger children to visualize trades when it wasn't just a theoretical thing, but they could actually see that you had a wheat and they had a wood and that you might trade. So we played dozens of games. When I started recording my plays on Board Game Geek, actually I started before I recorded them on Board Game Geek on Excel spreadsheets. I missed all the plays before January 1st, 2002. And I think one of the games that I missed the most plays of is Settlers, because we played many dozens of games with my family mostly. Joe started recording in 1996, so he
still missed a very large number of plays of Settlers. Right.
And the other thing I was going to say was, in my mind, I have a distinction between old games and new games. I started playing games sort of seriously in 1964. There's a story about that. You could listen to it on a different podcast episode. So by the time Settlers came out, I had been playing games for 30 years. Many of them, the Avalon Hill games and the strategy and tactics games and the 3M games. And when Settlers came out, and after just a few plays, I thought to myself, wow, this is a different game. So if you ask me about old games, I think, well, an old game is one that came out before Settlers came out in 1995. And if you ask me new game, I say, well, a new game is one that came out after Settlers came out. So 96 and subsequent, those are the new games. And it always gives me a mental jolt when I hear somebody talking about an old game and they're talking about something that came out in 2014 or something like that. It's like,
yeah, I'm right. I'm right there with you. I consider that this game has such a huge shift that I consider like all my Avalon Hill gaming way back in the day. That's like old, and then like anything after Catan with this is like the newer stuff. And I know when people's like, I played this old game from like 2007. I'm like, really? That's an old game? I mean, yeah, I hear you. I hear you, man.
So, just a little bit of history, I guess, quickly. I'm not by any means an expert, but I owe an awful lot to Catan. It was for about 3 or 4 years when I was first getting into the hobby, the only game that I associated with. It was all that I played. I was a part of a group where we didn't play board games; we played Catan. And we actually did call it Catan, and we called it Catan from like the beginning and never called it Settlers. And so, and this was before it was just called Catan on like the bumper sticker and on the board game box. So I feel like, part of the movement to call it Catan. The game itself, though, was like the first sort of venture away from the classic board games that I had been growing up with, Stratego, Lord of the Rings, Risk, among other like mass market games. But this is really what ushered me into the larger hobby. And when I saw a YouTube video called like top 10 board games of some sort, I was like, I wonder which ones they'll say. And I'd never heard of any of the top 10. And I was like, what? So Catan was what definitely, you can call it the topsoil that everything else kind of needed to grow.
Yeah. It's hard not to. It's hard not to just realize what an impact this game had. But and at the time, and this is a question I want to throw at you two guys: is that it's really hard to appreciate what the mechanics. I mean, the mechanics of this game have become almost standard for almost every board game that's come after it. But Eric? What do you think the mechanics were about this game when it first came out that really made it stand out as unique? That really made it take off?
To me, the thing that makes this game special is the trading. And, I see people today, it's often popular to criticize Settlers. And I think there are people that don't want to have to account for other people when they play games. And in Settlers, you have to account for other people. And if I can make an analogy, if you think about 18XX, 18XX is a game where there are two parts. There is the placing of a track and buying trains and all those sorts of things. And then there's the buying stock part. And in my view, the operations part of 18XX sort of provides the backdrop upon which the trading, the stock buying sort of matters. And to my mind, the board play on Settlers is the backdrop that makes the trading matter. So oftentimes people will try to have a trading game, but why are you trading these things? In a pit, for example, you're trading the commodities because they're worth, $100 for wheat or whatever it is. But in Settlers, when you're trading and you don't have any ore and you desperately need that ore to get a city, that trading becomes much more critical. The other thing that's cool about Settlers is that trading, when done properly, helps both players. And I sort of have a favorite story about this. My friend Andy Latto talks about a game he played once with 3 people from somewhere else, and they sort of all knew each other. And as he was playing, they were ridiculously friendly. They were, helping each other, almost playing it like a cooperative game. So one of them would say, I need a wheat. And the other people would fall all over themselves trying to trade them a wheat, even if what they were getting back wasn't that important to them, just to be cooperative. And Andy, of course, being a gamer, he was way too smart to get involved in this nonsense. And then halfway through the game, he realized that he was hopelessly behind because they had all been helping each other by trading things, and he had been refusing to participate. So, it's a game where if you trade, you will do better than if you don't trade. Now, I'll admit it takes 2 people. So if you're in a game of 4 people and 3 of them refuse to trade, then you can't trade. But if even 2 of you trade, the 2 of you will do better than the 2 people that don't trade. And so it's that pull to have that social interaction. And when I play, I think of a few people that I play with that are really good players. And often it's because they are creative in how they trade, what they trade for, when they trade. They just do a better job of that. And, so many board games are calculational. Joe and I are both sort of mathematical engineering, computer scientist type people, like many of the people in this hobby. And, Settlers is a game that appeals to salespeople and, people who enjoy interaction with other people. And so the person that would consider almost all of the games that we play just boring and painstakingly calculational, they still like Settlers because the board play is not so complicated as to overwhelm the fun that they have in interacting with people.
So I have to add something because I have a different perspective on this.
Go for it.
In my view, what made Settlers so different, so popular, is that it provided essentially a market improvement on Monopoly, in that you aren't trying to bankrupt everyone else, but you are just trying to build to be the best first. So Monopoly is a game that gets a lot of harassment in the hobby, but there's a reason that Monopoly has been around for, depending upon how you count it, over 100 years now, and has been as successful as it is. And at the root of it, it is a game about trading and building your economic empire. Settlers offers something of the same thing with something very similar in terms of rolling dice for resources versus rolling dice to move around. The difference is that in Settlers, give or take, your score is always increasing. And it's no longer a trying to beat everyone down, but a trying to build up your position. This is one of the reasons that my wife, who is not particularly fond of games in general and really dislikes Monopoly, likes and will play Settlers, because of that aspect of building rather than hurting other players.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I would agree with that largely. And I would try to pick further backwards, even into what you were saying there. I think that there's a school of design that was sort of the environment under which it developed was, sort of your Europe, post-war Europe, and specifically in Germany, where it was, it's taboo to have there be, direct combat in a board game. And the idea of there being one person left at the end on top of the pile is kind of troubling to a people that, were the losers of the two greatest conflicts that our world's ever seen. And so you see these approaches towards interaction that emphasize, as you mentioned, Joe, like instead of tearing others down, but rather the sort of like building up of your own thing and trying to be the best at what you did, but then not taking from others, but rather, trying to sort of make the best deals and end up with the nicest, largest house that you can passive aggressively show to all your friends in your wallet-sized photos.
So, while I agree with some of what you're saying there, I'd also note that Monopoly was very popular in Germany, and to the best of my knowledge, remains very popular in Germany. And so it's while there may be a desire for that type of element in games, it wasn't that there was a demonstrated need for that based on how games were selling. It was more just that in many ways in Germany, Settlers was not a revolution, but a result of an evolution that had been occurring since the Spiel des Jahres was started in 1979.
Fantastic perspective. Yeah, I feel like this evolution could have come in many forms across the Atlantic to get to the U.S. And as you mentioned, it's kind of like a tidal wave. I mean, crossing the Atlantic like a tidal wave. Now, had it, had it been earlier, would there have been earlier games in this sort of, the development of the modern tabletop hobby through the Spiel des Jahres? Could there have been earlier glimpses of this that would have spread to where we wouldn't necessarily see Catan as such an ubiquitous, part of this hobby and entry point for so many gamers? Is it somewhat arbitrary? Is it a right place, right time? Is it because this game really did, fire on all the cylinders? And since you both were there, I think you've already sort of maybe answered the question a little bit, that it was the tidal wave where it was this game. It wasn't just like the evolution of the school. It was that this game finally was nailed all these different parts that had been, kind of being refined, but to the point where this enters into a interactive place, but a place where interaction doesn't necessarily have to be just, I stab you, or I take this from you, or I fight over this with you. It can be like we both end up on the best, in better positions because of our interaction.
So I would note that while Settlers was relatively early in terms of German games to come over to the US, it was by no means the first. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the games that was part of that evolutionary process in Germany, Adelverpflichtet, if I can say it, Adelverpflichtet, was actually brought over to the US by Avalon Hill as by hook or by crook, and was available and had no particular impact. Kremlin was brought over by Avalon Hill, had no particular impact.
Yeah, I remember that.
There are, Settlers was far from the first game to be brought over. It was the first one to be brought over and really be so successful.
Part of it is, I think, that most of these games, when they were first brought over, it was the German language version that was brought over. Today, we're used to language-independent games where the rule book, has different languages, but the components don't have language. Mm-hmm. I remember I mentioned Carol Monica and the games people play. I had bought games from her before, none with the same impact as Settlers. But usually when I would buy a game from her, she would hand me a typewritten, stapled sheet, on 8.5 by 11 white paper that would have a translation of the rules into English that somebody had done. And, you'd get the German game and you'd open the box and there would be the German rules, but you had this white typewritten sheet of paper, which then you would, fold up and so it would fit in the box and you could play it that way. But, it was not that easy to transmit the rules of that game, from one group to another. Whereas Settlers, the rules were easy enough that you could play Settlers with someone, and if they bought their own copy, now, admittedly, if it was Mayfair, it was an English copy, but they didn't even have to read the rules of the English version. If they'd played it with you once, usually they remembered it well enough to play it by themselves without reading the rules. Today, we have YouTube videos teaching the rules of almost anything. There were no such things back then. And so I think that was another factor that really facilitated the spread of Settlers, was people's ability to play it once, then go back and learn it. I will say that some of those people misremembered some of the details of the rules and not essentially accidentally inventing variants. And
never has happened before with any popular mass market games.
Ever.
That still happens today, of course. But Settlers was able to survive that because the fundamental engine of the game was simple enough, and the game worked even if you didn't get the rules all perfectly right because of the trading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there are three things that this game does that I think may have contributed to its success, and I'm curious what you guys think about this. And the first one is the trade aspect, and that before this game, even some years after this, when you usually trade stuff, something usually has an inherent value over something else, right? Like this is more valuable than this, and this is more valuable than this when you go to trade. In Catan, that is entirely dependent on the person you're trading with. So you are setting the value of what you want, what you're going to give up. That was pretty big. I mean, I remember when I was first playing this, trying to explain that to people, like, well, which was more valuable? I'm like, it doesn't matter. It's what we're haggling this. All this is essentially equal, except what value you put on it. So that was I think that was a pretty big thing.
I will jump in a minute and say that's certainly not unique to Settlers, in that Monopoly also has that. If you have Park Place, then I have Boardwalk. Boardwalk's worth a lot to you, but if Joe doesn't have either of those, it may not be worth as much to him. So you have a little bit of that there. Another example would be Civilization or Advanced Civilization, which Civilization came out in 1980. And, if I have a bunch of cards of a given type, then another card of that type is more worthwhile to me. But that's not nearly as easy or short a game to play.
Yeah.
I hear about people that talk about, multi-hour Settlers games. And I figure they must not be trading at all, because the more you trade, the faster the game goes. But if Joe and I and two of our group played Settlers, I would be shocked if the game took an hour. Now, technically, we could all roll nothing but twos the whole time, and if nobody a settlement on two, but you're never going to do that. So the length of the game does depend a little bit on the rules that you have, but in general, it's a trading that's not only what you said. I agree, TC, that the fact that the values are naturally differentiated, and by the way, they shift over time. So early in the game, you might want wood and bricks. Later in the game, you might prefer wheat and ore. But that's one.
And nobody ever wants your sheep.
Yeah, but that was a kind of a big jump, at least for my game group when I was explaining it when we first played it a long time ago. It's like, these are all that we're putting the value on. The second one, and you hit on this, is the playtime, because some of the games I used to have that were published before this, if I broke out some of my favorite Avalon Hill games, we're talking about a 3 to 5 to possibly a 6 hour time investment. If we're playing Civilization, like you mentioned, that could possibly be a whole day affair, depending on if you got advanced Civ or not. Settlers, like you said, is like, it's an hour, 2 hours. Of course, we had all the expansions, and like you said, it could go a lot higher in playtime, but generally, it's a pretty quick game. And I think that's was a large appeal of it, is like you could break it out, play the game, go, wow, this is really interesting, and you could play it again.
Yeah, oftentimes you teach it to somebody, and the first thing they'd say after you were finished was, let's play that again.
Yeah. And we played when we were first playing Catan. We played like we played that thing like 5 or 6 times. I mean, just one after another. We were just fascinated with this thing worked. And other thing I think that this game that does was different was the use of dice. Because normally when people, I break out a game and you break out dice and people are like, oh, roll them. What's this random thing going to be? But Settlers use those dice as a curve, right, to get resources, which was pretty interesting. I mean, I can't think, maybe you guys can help me, I can't think of a game off the top of my head that implemented dice use in that particular way. Every time I seen dice, because I'm a war gamer, we rolled dice and looked on damage roll modifier charts, right? That's what I use dice for. This game comes out and we're rolling dice. We put them on the board, and that determines the distribution of resources that you could potentially get if you park your boat next to the thing. I was like, wow, that's a really neat use of dice. So that's kind of that's what, and I think people forget how innovative some of that stuff actually was, or how it was implemented in a game that was like it could be played about an hour and an hour or 2 hours.
Yeah. And I'm not denying that you played an hour, 2 hours, but I think of an hour game of Settlers as a long game of Settlers.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But the other thing I will say is, people still complain. I hear them whining, miserable, bitter whining about this game that, oh, I put my settlement on an 8 and no 8s come out. And, well, any game that has any luck in it, sometimes you're going to have a bad run of luck. But, if we were to play Hearts, and, you wound up getting bad hands, you wouldn't say, I hate Hearts because I had bad hands this time. You just understand that in a game that has randomness, you deal with your luck. And sometimes you have better luck and sometimes you have worse luck. But what Settlers has is, if you have bad luck, you do have the opportunity to improve things by making good trades.
You can negotiate. You can negotiate your way out of it.
Yeah, and somebody say, well, what if you never hit anything? Well, yeah, and you know, if you went to the casino and played craps and rolled nothing but snake eyes the whole time, you would lose all your money. But what's the chance of that happening?
I can't recall who said it, but someone noted that Settlers is a game that if things go well, you can blame it entirely upon your brilliant negotiation.
Yep.
And if things go poorly, you can blame it completely on those awful dice.
Right. But the other thing I would say is, you know, I should trade with you not just on how many points we're each going to get from it, but based on how much we each improve our winning probability. So let's say we're playing a game, and let's say, TC, you have 8 points, and I have 6 points, and Joe has 3. Well, I ought to be willing to give Joe a better deal than I'm willing to give you, because if you get from 8 to 9, you've dramatically improved your chances of winning. Whereas if Joe goes from 3 to 4, he may have improved his chance of winning from 4% to 6%. And that doesn't bother me so much. So if people are playing rationally, they're going to offer better deals to players that are behind. And that's sort of a natural catch-up mechanism.
I was about to say, that's one of my favorite catch-up mechanics is that, you know, you'd be like, yeah, I'm not trading with you. You're at 8 points. I'm at 9. Oh, Joe over here's at 4. I'm going to give him whatever the heck he wants because I'm going to bring him back into the game.
Yep.
Yeah, like I said, but it does take rational players, and I guess that could be a whole different subject we get into.
It's a game that if 3 people are stubbornly refusing to trade, then the 4th person can't do anything about it, and it can be a miserable experience.
I have a we've talked a lot about the trading so far, Eric. You've brought up the trading a lot, and I have a statement I'd like you to evaluate. And this is from a recent guest on another podcast who frequently participates in national Settlers of Catan championship and as well as like the National Agricola championship and the international one as well. But when I asked him, like, I was like, so how does trading usually go in a competition level, you know, higher level where you're at a tournament environment? You know, how do you trade with each other? Like, you know, you're playing with these people where you didn't choose to play with the people that are across the table from you. It's not that you have any sort of like a social responsibility to make it a pleasant experience for them. As a matter of fact, the more that they are suffering or that their game is suffering, the better, you know, it is for you. And his response to that was what kind of surprised me, because I expected there to be some sort of a change in the dynamic, but his response almost made it sound like there's just a change. You know, every player approaches it from a different angle. He said, well, I tend to not play much of a trade-heavy game. Like he made it sound like there was just like he really de-emphasizes trading in the way that he considers, you know, prepares for each encounter, for each, you know, game of it. How would you respond to somebody, you know, playing that style of a game, and, you know, that being something that could be different from player to player? Is it that players need to be open? What do you think?
That was Lumen Sperling, wasn't it?
Certainly was, yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed listening to that podcast. I noticed that he often said people claim it's a game of luck, but in his experience, the better players win a lot more than the people. You know, there are a lot of games like that. I noticed that, you know, to take a war game for the people, which is just full of luck. But yet James Pye has won the tournament 13 out of 15 years at WBC. So sure, there's a lot of luck, but somehow he manages it. And I guess I would say that if you have bad luck in Settlers, one of the things to do is to trade. I would say that, you know, really good players that I've seen will put a trade embargo in place under certain conditions when that trade embargo is going to help them. But if trading is the key to giving you a better chance to win, I think you're foolish not to do it. Now, evaluating when that is a difficult task. I'll give you an example of a game I played at WBC. I did not do very well in that game, but somehow I had quite a bit of wood and brick and not so much of the other stuff. And what I did was there were 2 other players in the game, and I traded wood and brick to them in such a way as to aid and abet their war over the longest road. Now,
how devious.
It's a benefit to them, but two people fighting over the longest road, they can both put a ton of effort into it, and only one of them is going to get the 2 points. And I thought to myself, I'm way behind. But if there was one of them that had the longest road, and I traded the other one some wood and brick so that he could challenge her for the longest road. And he was willing to give me some decent stuff, but not great stuff. But once I did that, then the other person who was the longest road competitor, all of a sudden she really wanted wood and brick, and so I got a better deal out of her. And then the brick guy gave me a good deal, so all of a sudden I was the wood and brick merchant, and I didn't win, but boy, I sure came a lot closer than if I hadn't done that. And that's just looking for a tactical opportunity, right? The same thing could happen with largest army, but longest road is the most obvious situation.
Oh man, that is such a Tammany Hall move. That's excellent.
Yeah, that was fun. I don't have the chance to do that very often, but I thought, wow, a longest road fight's going to be to my advantage if I make wood and brick. So I had fun doing it, even though I still didn't win. But I think I finished with 8 points, which was more than I would have.
That's pretty close.
Yeah, one of the my favorite, since we mentioned For the People, my favorite designers, Mark Herman, has often told me, and I've played enough war games to realize this, is that the dice favor no one. And if you go into any type of strategy in a game dependent on the dice roll, you're going to lose.
Right.
So, when I hear the Catan special, it's like, well, it's just all random. I'm like, no. I mean, there are random elements to it, but if you're playing it for the random elements, you're not going to win the game, and that is not a strategy to use for this thing.
I think I've probably played the base game nearly 100 times. Joe's probably played it more than I have. And, if you play the game 100 times, 5 out of those 100 times, you're going to take a really bad beat because the dice are just horrible. But I love the game. The fact that once out of 20 times, I just get crushed by the dice, that's okay.
Yeah.
And then maybe the same number of times the dice all roll well for me and I win and I feel like I didn't deserve it. But, I think that's another phenomenon of today's board game, mentality, is you only play every game once or twice. And so if you happen to have bad luck, well, that ruins the game for you. In a game like Settlers, I don't want all the games to feel the same. I want to have some games where I'm desperately trying to claw my way back from a hole because the dice hurt me. And I want to have some games where somehow I get lucky and I get off to a big lead and I get to, say "wah ha ha," and they all, conspire together to stop me.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely can agree with the whole playing a game twice and saying it's broken is a part of an issue going on in today's board gaming culture, because every time I break out like Dune or Rex more specifically, and one of those crazy combinations come out and everybody, oh, that's just overpowered. You just can't beat that. And you're like, well, no, you have to know it can happen and how to anticipate preventing that. But yeah, I hear you with the, I only played it twice. It's random. Yeah, whatever. So if you guys have any experience with this, so we've talked about the base game, and there's been several expansions to the base game.
Oh,
I haven't played any of them.
Whoa, man! Whoa!
Do we need to go back?
Okay, already into expansions, sir.
Sorry.
Got to score juice out of this thing.
Yeah, man. We got some stuffs. We got some stuffs. We got to wring that washcloth. I had a couple of questions here.
Go for it, Joe. Right. Go. I was trying to transition. I failed. I can admit my mistakes.
Oh no, you're totally cool, dude. Here. There's the things that I wanted to say will apply, and maybe I can get you back to that leaving off point. But I wanted to say, the layout of the board, the placement of the different the tokens that will tell you what pays out, whenever dice are rolled, certain territories will pay out. I think we've seen that copied in other games. It's something that, is just like almost, I feel like dice resource production. If you have that in a game, people are going to immediately recognize it as being like something from Settlers of Catan. Like when you roll dice and you see like games like Machi Koro that.
Yeah.
Machikoro, Space Base. I mean, it's very popular mechanisms to try to copy pieces of Catan and try to, make that sort of in capsule form, just the dice output, just the dice production without any trading. And so you got a really classic thing. One thing that always fascinated me about it, though, is that it's like the game itself, at least in the edition that I played. Now, earlier editions might not be this way, but it almost is like a light lesson in statistical probabilities, like in that, how often do certain rolls come up. I can remember before I played this game, I never had considered that like Snake Eyes and Boxcars hardly come up on a die because it's like a 1 in 36 shot. But like this game really made me start considering that like dice, especially when there's two of them and you've got numbers, there's an awful lot more there than just like a D6. It's not an RNG. You've got different probabilities that's sort of like a bell curve towards the 7. And what do you think about like that being the way that that the production is generated? Like the influential like the way that you're using two dice to sort of move? I mean, you could say that like Monopoly has the two dice for movement as well, so the numbers come up in this. But I do think that like just the production here in this game and the way that they matched them to a two dice system is really just become a huge part. Almost like one of those things that's like a victory point track on the outside of a game board but I know this is much more mechanism based and not just a playability thing, but using those little statistical dots, like the 5 dots for the 8s and the 6s and the way they show up red, it's like new players, guess where you should build.
Yeah. The first copies that Joe and I played didn't have those dots.
Mm-hmm.
And I think somebody realized that not everybody knows that, and why handicap someone who doesn't know that an 8 is more common than a 3. But I think the other thing that they did is they didn't just randomly put those numbers down. They gave you letters A through P or whatever that they are, missing the letter I. And you're supposed to put them in a spiral pattern that guarantees you that there's not one spot on the board that's just way better than all the others, so that the first player gets a big windfall. I think some people don't even know that you're supposed to do it that way, and they put them out at random, which just sort of creates the potential of it being slanted. But it's certainly the case that some of the spots on the settlers board are better than others if you count the dots. But it's not just counting the dots. Another thing I do when I start the game is I look and see for each commodity how many dots are there on that commodity. Mm-hmm. And so if there are, let's give an example. People all famously say sheep are the least valuable commodity in settlers. If I'm sheep and the numbers on the sheep are 2, 3, 11, and 12, then all of a sudden, sheep are going to be hard to get. They may not be as least valuable as you thought. Similarly, ore is often a highly sought commodity at the end, but if ore is on 8, 8, and 6, maybe ore is not going to be as hard to get. So I think the fact that those numbers always give you, a reasonably balanced set of starting options, so that if you're the fourth player, you may not get the best spot on the board, but there's still going to be a good spot, and then you get another choice because of the switchback placement mechanism. I do understand that at WBC, oftentimes in the finals of Settlers, which I've never reached, in the finals of Settlers, often there's quite a long think as people think about their initial starting positions. And then the play goes quite quickly because, those starting positions matter, and you have to think not only how much production are you going to have, but what's the supply of everything, and what are the other players going to do, and what kind of trading leverage might that give me over them? I don't usually think about it that hard myself, frankly. But you can see that there's something to think about that positioning.
So
scarcity of resources is huge.
To throw in a complete aside, since you mentioned the probability of 2d6, growing up, friends' parents had a copy of Mr. President, which takes advantage of the properties of 2d6, and so I was familiar with what you would get with 2d6 long before I ever played Settlers.
So you had the old
but thanks to a different game.
Mm-hmm. So definitely something that wasn't like brand new, but the recipes that you're making, like the reason people point at sheep as being the least valuable resource is because arguably your wood and your brick being used for roads are a very important combination. Now, wood and brick are used for roads. Wood, brick, sheep, and wheat are all used in the forming of a new town, but you have to have built a road from your starting to be able to build a new, I guess they call them like settlements, right?
Right.
But sheep is only going to pop its head up in needing a single sheep and needing that only in a settlement, which also requires 3 other single resources, or in a development card, which includes 2 other singletons. The reason that like wheat and ore, which are in ore is only needed in cities, but there's like you need a lot of it. So like there's if you're going to build one of everything in the game, first of all, you might, I guess wooden brick doesn't really make sense because you're usually going to need to build multiple roads. Like you need to build lots of them. So like that wooden brick needed for roads is like makes wooden brick much more important. But you're not going to be building that many cities. However, when you do build a city, you need lots of wheat, you need lots of ore, and then you need wheat for like everything. Is wheat the best resource in Catan?
It depends on the board layout. I will say that generally wood and brick are useful early, ore and wheat are useful late, because usually, as you say, you're building roads to set up your network and getting a few settlements out early. And at the end, often maybe you're hemmed in so much you can't build any more settlements, but you gotta get those cities down. Now, the value of development cards varies, but they could really bring you back from a tough situation if you hit the jackpot on exactly the one you want. And the one you want can vary from situation to situation. I would say that more commonly, brick and ore are the 2 things people find the most valuable in more cases, because there are only 3 brick and 3 ore hexes in the game, and there are 4 of each of the others. There's 19 spaces on the settlers board. There's 1 desert. There's 4 wood, 4 sheep, 4 wheat, 3 brick, and 3 ore. So, another consideration is that the thing there's only 3 of is going to tend to be more valuable. But it all
makes sense.
Now we're back to talking the mechanics of this thing. Another complaint I hear about this people don't like is the robber. What do you guys think of that? Because I mean,
direct interaction.
Oh man, that is just a way just to lock someone down out of something that they're using. And more than the dice in my game groups, I've heard people moan about the robber. What do you guys think about that?
So again, this gets back to Eric's comment about rational players. If you have rational players, the robber tends to be used logically, and usually people can reasonably expect that they should be the one getting the robber, assuming someone else is the one in charge of it, and they'll get it.
If they're leading.
Exactly. Or if they're in second place, but the leading person is the one who gets to place it.
Right.
And so I can see it. If you have people randomly choosing where to put it, I can see that being an issue. But with rational players, I've not seen it be an issue.
Yeah, I see irrational robber play more often than I see irrational play of other things. Some people feel like it's a 4-player game, so I should hit each of my 3 opponents the same number of times with a robber. Or even more crazy, I see people say, well, Joe has the most cards, bad Joe that is, Joe has the most cards. And really, maybe if Joe has the most cards, I ought to not rob for him in case the person on my left rolls 7 and Joe loses half of his hand. And another thing that could happen is maybe we're all desperate for ore, and TC, you just got 2 ore in your hand. They're your only 2 cards, and pull the dice, and I get the robber. Well, guess what? Maybe even if you're not winning, I'm going to put the robber on a space where I can steal from you to get one of those precious ores.
Right. Ideally, a space that most hurts the leader while allowing you to steal the critical ore.
Right. So there's a lot of things to think about, but I do see people do things that hurt the leader not enough and hurt people who are trailing too much compared to what I would think would be the best move. And I can see that you could be bitter about that.
Well, I can also say from experience, if you hit someone with a robber irrationally and they have a lot of cards in their hand, they're really not going to be inclined to trade with you anytime soon.
It might lead to some take that play, which is not going to help either of you.
Yeah.
To what degree do you think a player is laying out everything that they're going to do at the very beginning of the game? I think you hinted at this in saying that the final table of the championship of the Settlers of Catan is going to have a long wait time during its initial placement, but then a quick play after that.
I think that there's no way for you to program out your game in advance. What I think you're looking to do is give yourself options. And those options can be in different ways. They can be trying to get a reasonable spread of resources, but not always. I played a game recently where I put one of my spaces was on a space that had 2 woods and a wood port. It was actually a port. And the other space was a wood and 2 bricks. And so I had 8, 9, 10 of wood, and I had 10 of 5 of bricks. I was only on 2 spaces. But I said to myself, I think people are going to want to be trading with me for the bricks because nobody else is going to have good bricks. And I'm going to get a ton of wood, and people are going to want to trade for that. And if not, I can trade it with a wood port. You know, I think beginners maybe never place it on the port because they think, oh, the dots aren't very good on the port. But if you put it on the port and you got a good supply of that. Now, it turned out it didn't actually work for me as well as I wanted it to. But you know, there's a lot of approaches. I think you think of an approach. You think about what's your supply of different things going to be, assuming reasonably likely die rolls. Another thing you could think about is there a way to place my settlements in such a way that nobody can hurt me without hurting themselves? Now, of course, the answer is no. But you could say, well, you know, Joe's most valuable spot is this 8 ore, and if I put my settlement next to the 8 ore also, then he's not likely to put the robber there. So, you know, you can't cover all your bases. I was going to say another thing in conjunction with this, maybe answering your question in a different way, is that a modern design might seek total symmetry among the 5 different commodities, because symmetry is desirable in modern games. And Klaus Teuber, the designer of this game, you know, obviously did not create symmetry. You know, wheat is not the same as brick, and sheep is not the same as ore. They're all different, and so the balance of resources has to be addressed by the players, and then of course the dice have something to say about it too. You know, there's always that game. I can think of the game I played. It was probably more than a year ago, but it still sticks in my mind, where I had somehow 2 settlements on 3s, and 3 was rolled 7 times in the game. Now, that's way over the odds, right? And I really scored on the 3s. Of course, my 6 didn't do very well at all, so it sort of made up for it. But, you know, it's kind of neat to not have that symmetry. You got to kind of think about it.
To what degree do you think players are, like, if you're taking a non-trading approach, maybe this is more likely, but I've not yet heard you mention what I like to call the lemmings approach to the game of Catan, and that is to march to the sea, to find the trade ports. There are different ports around the outside of the board, which will allow you to trade against the game at varying degrees of effectiveness, like 2 for 1 if you have a specific resource, or 3 for 1 with any resource. Do you guys find yourselves pursuing those ports?
I think that strategy might be effective if the other players undervalue access to the ports. In the games I play, usually people are pretty interested in those ports. And I think you suggest that there's 2 options. One is just get a single 3-to-1 port. The problem is you often can trade with other players at 1-to-1. 3-to-1 isn't really very good. The other is to get a 2-to-1 port, but you know, if you get more than 1 2-to-1 port, that's hard to do. And then you also have to have a supply of that stuff. So getting the 2-to-1 brick port is no use if you don't have many bricks. You could trade for them, perhaps. And So I think I see them as helpers for a strategy, but I don't see them as a strategy in a box in most cases. Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. It's definitely a if you know that you are sitting down with people who don't care to trade, well, then you probably want to
Right.
value ports more heavily.
Yeah.
But that's again one of the knowing the audience where you can,
Yeah.
and taking advantage of whatever everyone else is undervaluing.
Right. I will say that there can be a groupthink. The most extreme form of groupthink is a group where three people refuse to ever trade. Then, of course, there will be no trades. The other version of a group think is you have a group where people are very willing to trade. My story about Andy was the extreme example. But, if one of the non-traders were to join our group, where we're not trying to help the other person win. We're just trying to make trades that help. I'm trying to make a trade that helps both me and you win. And if I can make me win a little more than you, that's fine. But, imagine that I make 3 trades. I make one with Good Joe, and it gains me a 1/6 of a victory point and gains him a 1/4 of a victory point. And then I make one with TC that does the same thing. And then I make one with Bad Joe, and it does the same thing. You've each gained a 1/4 of a victory point, and I've just gained a 1/2 of a victory point. I'm ahead. Now, of course, you all could do that strategy, but if we all think that way, we're all going to be looking for trades, right? And so in our group, if one of the non-traders came and saw all the other 3 of us trading, well, that person might berate us and say, "What are you doing? You're just giving the game to them." But how could we all be giving the game?
Yeah, I hear you.
Trade, they would be behind, unless they got really lucky with the dice. And so I think any good Settlers player in that situation jumps in and trades and tries to trade better than the other people.
It sounds like there's a lot of variables. And so, I mean, what it sounds to me is that this is getting you into a position where you're like, it sounds to me like you're drawing on experiences where these sort of claims that I'm trying to make here, which are just, I want to highlight, I want to kind of put the spotlight for a moment on that aspect of the game, see what you think about that aspect of the game. And you're saying that, it's kind of part of a larger ecosystem. Does that, so far, that sounds like what we're getting at is that each of these different pieces can be used depending on how this game is doling out resources, how this game is set up, where players are at, what players, obviously there's a lot of interaction when you've got to trade. You have to be able to trade with someone. These are all different aspects that sort of make Catan about as much of a group experience as it is an individual experience.
Absolutely. I think that it's a different game when you play it with different players. And I am less interested in playing games, often they're modern games, where it's the same game no matter who you're playing with. I want a game to be different when I play with different people. What's the point of playing with people if they are not going to affect my experience? And of course, they always expect my experience by the banter, but I want the game to be different because I'm with different people. You mentioned Machikoro. I'll have to see what Joe thinks today of Machikoro, but I really dislike Machikoro because to me, Machikoro was like Settlers without the trading. And I think to myself, Settlers without the trading, but trading is the thing I enjoy most about Settlers. I enjoy the other part, but I enjoy the other part partly because it's the substrate on which the trading is based. So, so the fact that you have the trading is an essential part of my enjoyment of the game.
So I still very much enjoy Machikoro. But I enjoy it for different reasons from those that I enjoy Settlers. Machikoro for me, while it has some similarity to Settlers in terms of using dice to get resources and having items that receive resources regardless of who rolled the dice, is really more of a filler, build your economy quickly by buying wisely into something, something that has a better chance of panning out and happens to play out for you. There is much less room for saving yourself through good strategic play than there is in Settlers. And as a result, it's not a game for everyone, and not one that I know Eric's so fond of.
But is Catan a game for everyone? I think what you've mentioned there, Joe, and especially how you accentuated that it is okay. There are elements about it that you appreciate that Eric does not like it kind of as a ticket. I understand both of your perspectives. I would use the comparison between Machikoro and Catan as almost like this inverse relationship, with where we see simple deck building starting from. Whereas Ascension, we see the game of Ascension, which is, in my opinion, a very almost invertebrate deck builder, where so much of the game is dependent on what cards so happen to come out of this deck that's all shuffled. And there's really not much, everything is just a tactical decision. But then when you look at a game like Clank, which has recently come out, it sort of gives a bit of a spine, a board on which this sort of random generation tool is actually has you've got decisions that you can make, and you can do a lot more like probabilities because you have sort of more carryover from one turn to the next. I think that Catan has that sort of inverse relationship where you have the vertebrate being the first game, where Catan has got this board that sort of gives it a cohesiveness, in impact, something more than just like you're getting to lay the die out before you just have to roll them. It's like you're laying out your possibilities, and then you're seeing whether or not the bets that you made are going to pan out. Whereas in Machikoro, it's like I feel like there's either you choose to go, I'm going to buy this one card and hope that it's a great card, but it's a 12. So when it hits, it's huge, but 12s are so rare that it's just that I'm hoping. Essentially, it's like playing a slot machine. It's like I hope that my tenure with this building is going to net more than what the designers expected when they balanced this based on the number it is versus all the other ones. I don't know if that makes any sort of sense there, but that's sort of like comparison between. And I know that using something like vertebrate, invertebrate, to me, it was better than saying Machikoro is a spineless Catan, but that's kind of what I'm getting at.
I'm sure Eric would be sympathetic to that view. So one thing I should say about Machikoro, I have tried playing Machikoro with an expansion once. I will never do that again. The expansion dropped the game from one of my favorites to one that is I do not have any willingness to play again.
Was it totally broken? Because my game ended up in like a fairly impossible state when I tried with the first expansion.
It was not an impossible state. It was just a completely unenjoyable state.
Mm-hmm.
So what's clever about Machikoro is you have a set of options laid out at the start, and you have control over what direction you're going to go with it. Just as in Settlers, the board's laid out, and you have some control over what direction you wish to go with it. Settlers adds the opportunity to kind of adjust to how things are actually going with trades that Machikoro doesn't have. On the other hand, Machikoro is a 15-minute game. Settlers is not. And so I guess I don't see that as an inverse. I see them as offering similar starting situations, but a difference in how they develop.
I would say something else, which I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but it made me think, back to my analogy of 18XX. 18XX is a stock game. And it's an interesting stock game because buying the stocks and selling the stocks is about the board. Another game that maybe is somewhat analogous is Acquire. Acquire is a game where you don't sell stocks, but you buy stocks, but that's very much dependent on the board. I don't know if I can think of many games that are stock market games that don't have some meaningful sort of board or equivalent to base themselves on. I can think of Friedman Freeze's Black Friday maybe is the best example, and it's sort of rooted on the big crash that's going to happen. But if you look, say, at stocks and bonds, or even speculation, which is a cute game, but it's hard to have a stock market game that's really enjoyable if it's only about stocks. And similarly, a trading game benefits from being about something. Although I'll admit that I like hit quite a bit, as does Joe. So I don't see the. Maybe it's the spine. I call it the substrate.
The substrate.
Okay. Yeah, that's a much better, like, more diplomatic term for it.
Yeah, it means the same thing, but it's more polite. But I see the fact that the game of Settlers is about trading, and that it needs the board to make the trading interesting. It not only interesting, but it makes it urgent for the players. Like, you have to get this trade done, right? You have, I'm building toward a spot where I want to build a settlement, and you could build to that same spot, and only one of us is going to get to that spot. And TC, you have the key card that's going to let me get there. Right? I get there, Joe's not getting there, but if I don't get it, he might get it. Like, you can kind of like extract a fairly high price, assuming I have the cards. Like, if you try to get a too high a price, I can't build my thing, and then it's worthless to me. But it's not just that you want to build your economy. It's sometimes I want to build it right now to get there before somebody else does.
Well, I feel rather shallow. The reason I didn't like the expansion of Machi Koro, the first one, is I got a first printing of Machi Koro, and the first expansion of Machi Koro, the cards were slightly bigger than the original cards, and it drove me up the wall, and I never played it again.
Get with that company, man.
I tried. IDW never responded to anything.
They had like such a hugely successful game. They should be able to support the game.
It sat on my shelf collecting dust. So there's my shallow reason why I haven't played Machi Koro.
What you just said, Eric, made me like the whole trading is being fueled by experienced players can take it to the next level by trading based on the current game state. The board is a way for players to be able to observe and speculate, to a certain extent about what the game state currently is, about who's in the best position, who is getting the right resources, who's next to what they should be getting. And you're sort of like, every time you make a decision, it's a rational move. It's not just a place the robber here, though that element of the game is one that I think draws a lot of people in as well, because it does have a light element of that, boom, I get to place the robber here, and I love doing it to my friend who's always the guy who wins all of the games that we play with.
Yeah, and a game where the best player always wins, it has its place if you're going to play Go or chess, or maybe even two-player Kalis.
Wow, that sounds like something that could be really intense.
A lot of situations, you don't want a game in which the best player is always going to win, right? Because the player who knows that they're not that good in a 4-player game, they might know that their chances aren't 25%, but they want to win some of the time. And, they don't want that one player to win all the time. So, there needs to be enough variation in the game, and part of that variation is in the die rolls and so forth, and the development card draws. But part of the variation is in the behavior of the players. The designer had to decide how much variation there was going to be. And as Lumen Sperling said to you guys in that other podcast, the best players really do win quite a lot more than the weaker players. But the weaker player never is going to go into the game thinking, oh, look at who my opponents are, I have no chance. They're going to maybe say, well, I'm going to have to play really well or get lucky. As Joe said, when they win, it's playing really well. If they don't win, it's not getting lucky. But that's what you want in a game, right? So when it was my wife and I and our 2 kids, the kids didn't win as much as we did, but they won some of the time, right? And it was especially exciting when the kids won a game against their parents, even if it wasn't a quarter of the time.
Fantastic. I have 2 kind of main closing points before TC we can go ahead and maybe segue into other periphery products like the other Settlers of Catan, like just the entire environment. But before we get to that, I don't know which one's the more appropriate one, so I'll just go into the first one that I think maybe this will get a strong reaction. When I first came onto the Longview, it was to do an episode about the game Terra Mystica. And one statement that I made in that episode and that I used to torment the previous host of the Longview, Jeff Gamble, to no end. It was Jeff at that time, but TC, I don't think I could even torment you, man.
If I tried
to torment you, I think it would cause some sort of perverse pleasure that would be like, oh, Joe's messing with me. I've turned him into the necrovirus. Anyway,
I am a sucker for attention. Anyway,
well, with Jeff, I said that Terra Mystica is like you take the randomness out of Catan. So if you want to play the Catan that has the no randomness, may the best player win in all circumstances, play Terra Mystica. And it's got all the checked boxes for buzzwords that are new, that are going to be all the hype, your variable player powers. You've got variable setup. And the thing is, like, the game itself, though, is about building things that give you production and trying to make the largest network, and there are other elements. Now, what do you think about my bold claim that Terra Mystica is like Catan on steroids?
Well, steroids, I understand they're bad for you.
And this is coming from an 18xx player whose 18xx players tend to be kind of Terra Mystica tangential. Either you love it or you hate it, maybe. Are you in the hate it group?
I played it once, and it just seemed like it had more moving parts than it was worth to me. But I'm not here to really criticize it. What I would say is that any game that you have more than 2 players has a tendency to have unpredictable things happen. One of the games that's notorious for this is Puerto Rico, where admittedly there is some randomness in the plantation draws, but it's not very much. But the randomness in Puerto Rico comes from your opponents doing things that you aren't expecting and or think are stupid. One of my favorite things about Puerto Rico is when someone does something and people all yell at them for throwing the game, and then that person wins. And then the people that aren't happy, they, if they're not careful, they say, I lost. You won because you played wrong. If you hadn't played wrong, I would have won instead of you. And of course, that's the most ridiculous thing in the world, but that's almost how people feel. So I don't think I can very much on Terra Mystica with my one game experience, but I suspect that even in Terra Mystica, you might say, I lost because TC played wrong.
To a certain extent, yes. There is a lot of meta discussion. It was fascinating to me to talk with the players that were in that final table at the WBC for that big tournament to discuss which of the fantasy races would be ones that would be up for selection for that final game, and which ones interacted with each other in what way. It's a fascinating discussion. Joe, do you have any experience or any comment to add, or are you just kind of in that same camp as Eric?
Well, I will just note that I have intentionally never played Terra Mystica. It's a game that was originally described to me as a cross between Kingdom Builder and Hansa Teutonica. And I had played both of those.
Uh-oh.
I couldn't tell you which I disliked more. And I have since been convinced, one, that really wasn't a fair description, but that, two, I probably wouldn't like Terra Mystica anyway. And so, if you want to call it Settlers on Steroids, that's fine by me. That convinces me that steroids are a bad thing, and therefore we should not put Barry Bonds in the Hall of Fame.
Well, I will then accept that everybody who's here in this table accepts my word as truth. The one spoken truth that Terra Mystica is Settlers of Catan on steroids, for better or for worse.
Joe and I both have a pretty good ability to not play games that we think we're not going to like.
Well, and then you definitely never will know if you like them then.
It's okay.
Oh.
Out there.
The final point that I alluded to earlier is one that was shared by a listener here who has been participating in our chat, and that was the question of so far in this episode, there's two different perspectives I feel like we can take on this, and one of them is like as a historical or historian's perspective, somebody who accepts the impact that Catan has had on the hobby, but does not, continually keep busting it out, keep playing it with new players, keep using it to introduce new players to the hobby. And the other side is sort of using it to, it still is just that game that you reach for every now and then. It's a game that's very much an active, getting its use. Seeing some table time. And getting played in the modern in this modern offering, where there's just so many different games that offer you similar, like a city building aspect, a route building aspects. There's so many different things out there. So what do you think about the fact that there's now so many titles to play? How does Catan maintain its relevance? Because clearly it's continuing to grow, but is it just familiarity that's breeding that? How is it still writing a golden age?
I'll just mention that every odd-numbered year, Joe does a geek list of his 185 or however many favorite games. And I'll just ask Joe to describe what the top of his geek list looks like.
So I've had, in fact, the same top 3 games. They did change. Number 2 and number 3 changed order once, but I've had those same games since I came up with the first list in 2005. I actually, the very top of that list, I first sent to Brian Bankler when he was collecting a top 100 for rec.games.board over 2 decades ago now. And for the past number of times, number 3 on the list has been 2038. Number 2 has been Bridge, and number 1 has been Settlers of Catan. And as a practical matter, Settlers is one of only 3 games that I have played every year that I've been recording my plays. So this goes back to 96. I have played Bridge every year. I have played The Great Del Moody every year, and I have played Settlers every year. It's very much one that I enjoy playing every bit as much today as I did 20 years ago.
And
fantastic.
For me, I have ratings. I put my ratings on Board Game Geek. It's complicated because there are expansions and all, but I've rated about 1,600 games. Not as many as Joe has rated, but I've rated about 1,600 games, and I think I have something like 16 10s, and Settlers is one of my 10s, which means I'll play it anytime with anybody. And I don't get to play it as much as I would like, because maybe this is TC's Bridge, by the way. Many of the people that really like Settlers want to play the expansions, and I like the base game more than I like the expansions. But often I find that if I'm at a convention, one of the things that I do is my wife and I host a home convention at our house twice a year. And, the people that come, some of them are, really dedicated gamers of the type that we all are. And some of them are more casual gamers that maybe come because a friend brings them. And oftentimes I'm able to play Settlers with them. On the other hand, I go to WBC and try to get a couple games of Settlers in on the second Saturday morning. And, those are people that really are into Settlers. They also have a Cities and Knights tournament earlier in the week, which I have no interest in. But so I don't get to play it as much as I would like, but I think I've probably played it 55 times since the beginning of 2002. So that's an average of 3 or 4 plays a year. I'd rather play it more like 7 or 8 plays a year. But I don't know, how many times have you played it, Joe, since 1996?
Since 96, over 100.
So he's played over 100, but he has an extra 16 years, 6 years to play. Right. So he plays it more. He plays it more often than I do. So we really both like Settlers, and it's something I'll play with anybody. I'll play with the same people that I play 1846 with, but I can play it with people that I couldn't play many of the games that I like with. So it's nice and versatile that way.
I will say, to be fair, I tend to use it to introduce people a little less than I perhaps at one point did. But as much as anything, that has to do with the fact that I'm introducing people to this kind of game much less often. More and more often, I'm finding, people have played this, or they've played Ticket to Ride, or and so they're coming in with much more knowledge than, I played Risk, a decade ago.
Yeah, and I would say I will use this or Ticket to Ride often as an intro game. And I make the decision between those depending on what I perceive the personality of the person that I'm introducing. And like I say, if it's a person whose interest is in human interaction and banter and discussion, and it's a person whose job is being a salesperson or one of those things, often I'll suggest Settlers. If it's a person who's maybe a little bit less outgoing, then I'll take Ticket to Ride, because you don't really have to talk that much in Ticket to Ride if you don't want to, other than to say 2 off the top, please. We do talk a lot in Ticket to Ride. So the answer is, for Joe and I, who are both quite experienced gamers, we're still liking it a whole lot.
Fantastic. I would echo that experience. When I first got into the hobby, I went through, in general, what I would call like that turbulent phase of realizing how large the hobby actually was, and I didn't realize how large it was. And then I was like, wow, and I thought it was just Catan. I thought Catan was something amazing. Look at all these other games that take elements of Catan and make them better, like ... And so for a while, my focus was that Catan was, kind of join the ranks to a certain extent of Monopoly. And I went to the local library for a game night that I was helping, just with like people from the community, kids, adults, and we used Catan, me and the librarian that was helping out with the game night, to introduce a couple, both a new adult and a new, I think about a 12-year-old kid, to the game, and just the joy that it brought them, and the sort of smooth, unmistakably refined mechanisms that have become the hallmark of the Euro invasion of what has really just become this renaissance and this golden age of modern board game, was very much on display. And my wife has been a part of games like that as well, and she's also been in the middle of the game of Catan and said to me, like, why don't we play this one more? Which is very rare to hear from my wife, because I'm usually she's on a steady diet of way more board games than she would ever want to play without me being her husband.
But perhaps it's partly because in many of the games that you might play with her, you just have an advantage. You have an advantage because you're probably more analytical. I don't even know your wife, but you're probably more analytical about board games because you focus on them more. And it's easy for that person, that significant other, or that child of a family to say, what chance do I have against the board game person in my family? But, Settlers doesn't really have, deep, dark secrets. Now, there's good play. Making the decisions is sometimes a real tough thing to make the right decision. And maybe, choice A is just a little bit better than choice B, and that's hard to see. But there's not many people that can't say, I can see all the things that I can do here in Settlers. I understand that I can trade. And it's like, you might have an advantage in Settlers because you have a more winning personality. Or you might have an advantage in Settlers because you've played it more times. But it's not the same advantage that you'd have in Terra Mystica, to pick something.
And on top of that, when you have a more experienced gamer and less experienced gamers, there's always the robber.
Right. So they can say, let's just put the robber on Joe until we have some reason to do otherwise, because we know he always wins these games. And let's see if he wins with a robber on him. And, some people just get irritated. I see posts on Board Game Geek. I play with my non-gaming friends, and they always put the rapper on me, and I'm thinking, well, what did you expect? You know?
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like rational behavior.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you guys give me a lot to think about this because teaching a game like Settlers, I mean, it's easy. There's nothing really hidden in the game, and even after you teach a game, you're teaching it for a first-time player. They feel like they have a chance to be at least competitive. Wherein, if I'm teaching a game like Brass, I've got to explain like 6 things this game's going to do. That if you're not aware of when this thing's going to trigger, you're going to be completely smoked out of it.
You mean those canals go away?
Yeah, things like that. So, yeah, I think maybe that's why it's endured so long. It's just the fact that it's easily accessible, easily taught, and has a not so steep learning curve, but a really good depth of play.
And another thing about it is many of the modern board games and the games we played back before Settlers, for that matter, even remembering the sequence of play is hard, right? Like I played Terra Mystica once, but I couldn't tell you what the sequence of play is. In Catan, somebody hands you the dice, and unless you want to play a soldier, you roll the dice. And then we all look and say, oh, it's a 10. And then we hand out commodities for whoever was on 10, right? And so you don't have to remember the rules to figure that out. You just check the dice in the tower, and then people help you do that. And then the trading phase happens, and you do have to remember that, but there's not a lot of rules about the trading phase either, right? You talk to people, so it's not a game where you need to learn a lot of procedural rules in order to play it. You have that little chart in front of you that says what it costs to get everything and what the victory points are. And so, I think a lot of people are intimidated not just by the decision making, but even by I can't even keep in mind what all the things I can do in my turn and what order are. And that makes them feel silly. And a game that sort of does that all part for you, is maybe more welcoming as well.
So are we ready to talk about expansions now and other stuff? Can I
Sure.
segue now? All right. Joe, is it okay? Bad Joe? Joe?
Made you wait about an hour, TC.
I know. I'm just making sure I have permission. No,
Yeah.
The reason I wanted to bring this particular one up is that I do not own base Catan. I think I own like every variation of it. Because my kids, I play Catan Junior. My 8-year-old loves it. I taught Kate to play it when she was his age. So I played a lot of it, which I call Pirates of Catan. And by the way, if you have a copy of Sigihara and you need castles, the Catan Junior castle pieces are a perfect substitute. FYI. FYI.
By Catan Junior just for the pieces.
Me and my wife played Rivals of Catan, which is like a 2-player card game, quite a bit. And I actually think I've played the Xbox Live version of Catan more than I've actually played the board game Catan.
I've actually logged like more than 100 plays on this Xbox Live thing. That's why, like, for me, like, my play count is so contaminated. It's been so many of those games.
And the Catan I'm actually rather fond of playing is the Star Trek one, because there's something about trading dilithium that just is a kick in the pants for me. In trading
that has
dilithium
variable player powers, right?
Yeah, it's very basic. I got Captain Kirk does something and Spock does something, and it's like from the movies. But it's interesting that even for me, even the re-implementation of a different theme on this base game is quite good. And we haven't even touched on like the expansions to the base game. Now, I haven't touched any of them. I don't know what any of them do. I have a neighbor down the street who has all of them in the original German. He's like a big Catan fan. But
you live next to Joe Huber? Is that
no. But
he doesn't have any expansions.
No, that's not quite true.
The original German. Ooh.
So does anybody have any experience with the expansion? It was just for sake of thoroughness.
Yeah, so I've played some of the expansions. Some of them are more harmless than others.
Harmless.
Are there because people like the game and they want the board play to be more intricate. And to me, that's just putting a bigger burden on my ability to trade. Like I have to work harder to get the same amount of trading.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that the Star Trek Catan with the extra powers, I don't object to that too much. There's a game called Seafarers of Catan, where instead of one monolithic island, you have sea hexes, and then you can build ships instead of roads that take you from one island to another. That's not too harmful. There's one called Cities and Nights, with a whole book full of upgrades that you can buy, and I dislike that one quite a bit. It's just too much overhead. I guess I would say in almost any game, I want to get the game experience with as little overhead as possible, and very few expansions reduce the overhead of a game. And so I would say, was this game missing something that I need an expansion? And the variability in the game doesn't have to come from an expansion. It comes from the fact that the tiles go down in different places, and more importantly, the players do different things. The dice do different things as well, I guess. But so when you mentioned that, there's one called Starfarers of Catan that we referred to, and that's somewhat like Seafarers maybe, in that you have ships that move around, but not very much like it. But to my mind, those games just take longer. They give me the same amount of fun in a little bit more time. That's my opinion. I certainly have friends who love playing it, that like these expansions. And when they come to our house cons, I try to play base Settlers with them. And then when they go on to do Settlers of Nuremberg or Game of Thrones Catan, I let them play with somebody else. Not that I don't like them. I'd rather play the game with them that I like to play with them rather than the game that I'm not so interested in playing with them.
So I remember when the 5-6 player expansion for the German Settlers came out. This was in '96. No, it really. So as a practical matter, it was not an awful attempt to try and expand the game to play with more players. The problem is that it's not really a 5 or 6 player game, and so it was doomed to not be very good. But it was interesting. I don't have it anymore. At the time, picked it up in the hopes that it would be, that it would magically make the game work for 5 or 6. It didn't.
It adds some extra phase to it, like because you need more windows. Like you can't just have it go around and come back to you, because if a 7 gets rolled in a 5 or 6 player game, it's going to come up more likely, and you're going to end up amassing more resources and just end up losing them.
Well, it adds additional trading.
Right, that's what he said. Yeah. What I was going to say was, you have to know about Joe that he is not someone who clings to games if he doesn't like them. How many games do you own, and how many have you previously owned, Joe, just to give people an idea?
So I currently have 241 games. I previously owned over 1,500, and that does not include expansions. But I suspect a similar ratio for those.
So Joe has found better homes for close to 90% of the games he's ever owned. So you have to understand that when he said he got rid of it, it's not exactly the same. It's not the same thing as you would say if someone else got rid of a game.
So he moves them out, kind of a revolving door sort of thing. So it's not saying that it doesn't work for it. It just wasn't exactly, you're keeping like the cream of the crop, and your collection is much more curated than most.
I think a number of people would argue that I'm not keeping the cream of the crop, but the cream of the odd. But in any event, let's see. I did play Seafarers and didn't find it memorable. I never actually did get to Cities and Nights. I do actually, while there are not a large number of expansions that I own at all, I do actually own one expansion for Settlers of Catan. Oh goodness, this is 5-6 years back. Ritter Sport came out with an expansion in Germany. So Ritter Sport makes chocolate bars, and so they came out with 8 chocolate.
Oh.
I saw that.
Did you try eating it and then selling it to somebody else, Joe?
Trading it?
No. I have to hold on to it because this way I can, if someone wants to play Settlers, I can give them their choice, vanilla or chocolate.
Oh, goodness.
I don't think
that
game would survive long in my household where chocolate's consumed very quickly.
No, this is not one that's made of chocolate. It adds chocolate as an additional resource.
Oh, cool! I actually saw a chocolate one.
They do have chocolate Catan. I've seen there's a box of Catan in our game store at least as of about a month ago that had a nutrition facts on the back.
Yeah,
of it.
I saw that. I was like, wow.
No. This is just an actual playing expansion that adds an element of basically it adds cocoa and water and some special nuts and things that you'd find in a chocolate bar.
Cool.
I'm actually kind of surprised that's one that you've chosen to accept because it sounds like it is kind of. Is it just a flavor difference? Is it the same as regular Catan, just a cosmetic change? Is that why you?
It is. So it's not a cosmetic change. It does actually add a little. It does not make the game longer, which is a big plus in my opinion. And it is. I don't know. It just the idea appealed to me, and I know it's one that is hard to find in the U.S., and so it sticks around.
There's also a version that is set in Scotland. It's Whiskey Settlers. The commodities are water and hops, and you can imagine. And when originally produced, it came in a round metal can, and it had its own tiny bottle of whiskey, the size that you would get on an airplane, maybe. Yes. And so I
did own that. I didn't keep that.
Yeah,
that didn't appeal whiskey does not appeal as much as chocolate. The one
my wife would agree
that I do have in my collection is Starship Catan. So Starship is in many ways the two-player equivalent of Starfarers. It is. For me, the reason it sticks in my collection has nothing to do with Settlers of Catan. It has to do with the fact that it's an interesting game of exploration, and it kind of hits that point for me in a nice two-player game. And in particular, it stands out for me because it's a game that both of my sons enjoyed growing up, and so played it a number of times with them, and learned to particularly enjoy it, and still have it around. But the connection to Settlers of Catan is fairly weak.
Yeah, it doesn't feel very much like Settlers.
No.
Interesting. So when it comes down to it, I feel like the entire world of Settlers of Catan expansions is huge. Like, I think it's one of the few games that you can compare to the amount of content that you can purchase for it beyond the base game to being close to like very few games. Age of Steam is the first one I think of that has like 100 expansion maps, 100 different ways to play the game. You've got differing levels, like you've got your Catan Histories that has like a Germany edition and American Revolution edition. You've got expansions that get as simple as just like a simple map or a simple, not even sometimes there'll be a paper map that suggests a certain shape and layout to tiles to basically tell the story of settling of different areas of the world. And I think that one of the ways that I was most struck in this last year's Gen Con was by what they were seeking to continue to do to innovate with this system of Catan. And the most recent one is called the Inca, like the Catan Inca. And it is, I believe it's INKA is how they spell it on the box. I forget exactly what it's called, but the when it comes down to it, you are not the Inca. It's the rise of the Incas, I think, because you are not the Incas. You are the sort of like smaller groups that eventually sort of consolidated into this Inca. Well, I don't want to say consolidated, but like the Inca culture sort of thrived in the wake of several different other smaller competing groups. And one thing that's added in this game is sort of a like a retiring of different cultures. So you will play as a certain culture, and then later on you will sort of retire that culture, go into decline, which makes a lot of folks associate this game with like Small World, where you have a race that goes into decline, and you'll put these like little plastic, almost like a plastic, it looks kind of like a plastic crown of thorns. It's really kind of like an overgrowth token that you put on top of the settlements that now say that, okay, well, these will continue to give resources to their owner, but you can build on top of it. So the board is like consistently changing. Just because it was built now doesn't mean it's going to look like that in several rounds. It's kind of like Brass, where you have like a bit of a reset that's going to happen at different rates for different players, further integrating elements that sound like they come from Small World. Add to that like alpacas and there's other, cocoa that are resources here. And I thought like, wow, they're really still pushing Catan. And it's one of those that I feel like it's happening at a different maybe substrate, that it's at a different level, where as a hobby gamer, I feel like anything that says Catan on it, it's immediately like got a marked like, oh, I'm not the audience. But really, like they're looking to integrate elements from lots of different newer games, expansions, things that Eric and Joe might frown on, but Bad Joe, which in my mind is Good Joe, actually is entertained by the concepts of these things. I'm not saying that I've played the game or that I understand the purity. If I'm going to be teaching it and using it, it depends on what type of tool I'm looking for. And let's just put it like this: that this is turning it into more of a multi-tool. Hopefully, not adding so many features that it's skimping on the ones that you've got and making them almost unusable, kind of like the Swiss Army knives where the toenail clippers is just impossible to use.
So I don't think Settlers is by any stretch unique in this. I mean, when you talk about games that have spawned families, Carcassonne, Ticket to Ride,
Bonanza,
they're
Monopoly.
Monopoly has a smaller trail of different games based upon the base.
But there's Monopoly, Tropical Lagoon, and things like that. Yep.
Certainly some of those. And I think what you're seeing is essentially these are key money makers for the companies. And one of the things that tends in these days to make a game an evergreen is continued release of new product. If it every year, there are a number of people who stop paying attention to Carcassonne expansions right about the time Catapult appeared.
I was gonna say the Catapult's
as a practical matter, new Carcassonne expansions still sell, still do well. Yes, it might not be what, gamer crowd is looking for, but tell me that Carcassonne doesn't have a family when you have Star Wars Carcassonne that lots of people in the U.S., where it was never sold, went to great lengths to try and get. It really is, it's not something that I would say is at all specific to Settlers, but simply an industry path to keep a game in the spotlight.
Yeah, and a cynic might say the same thing about 1829, which they could say that there's just a lot of spin-offs of that.
Yeah, I can see that.
But I think one of the appeals of this kind of game, and I can see the historical appeal. You can see that my draw to Settlers is not really the board; it's the trading. But the nice thing about these is often someone who's learned to play Settlers, the base game, can pick up this new game, whatever it is, Catan, Game of Thrones, or whatever it is, without learning a lot of new rules and play style. There may be a couple of new rules that are added, but, I'm not someone who's afraid of learning new rules for a game that I'm interested in. And so that might be part of it too.
Well, and I know people who are not particularly big fans of Settlers, who were thrilled that there was going to be a Settlers Game of Thrones because that's, that was a big appeal for them and drew them in much the same way that, Harley Davidson Monopoly is going to draw people who might not otherwise be interested in a copy of Monopoly.
You know, one thing I've noticed, this is off the side, but when I was young, motorcyclists were mostly about my age. And now that I'm this age, motorcyclists are still about my age. And I will play some of those, you know, if someone wanted to play Germany, Catan, or one of those. I wouldn't run away from it screaming, but I'd still rather play. You know, those games, they have a printed map board, and that map board is going to be the same every time you play it. But if I play Base Settlers, it's a different map every time I play it.
That's true. It has that baked-in variability from the outset. Input randomness that adds a lot of replayability to the base system itself.
Yep.
Okay. Well, all right. Sweet. So, sounds like we need to wrap things up. I know I'm getting a little tired. Is this an okay segue to end the show, Joe? Is it good? Okay, I just give you a hard time. Give me a hard time. Well, thanks, gentlemen, for being on. I was really excited when Joe had you scheduled to be on to talk about Catan, because it is it's a maligned game. It's a popular game. There's a lot of discussion about it, and it's really good to have two gentlemen on who can talk about it in depth and give it the attention it deserves. And it's I don't know if it's been discussed on the long view or not, but as far as I'm concerned, we can discuss it as much as we want, because everyone's going to have a different opinion on it, a different take on it. And it's one of those games that when you say modern board gaming, it's on the list, like it, hate it, or indifferent to it. It's just that simple. So thank you very much, Eric and Good Joe, for being on with us. Bad Joe, thank you for scheduling this and enduring me and keeping my transitions in line.
Yeah, as you tried to move on
I was just excited. I wanted to talk about my own boy playing Catan. Come on, throw me a bone here. Throw me a bone.
You know, I have to say, picking up on what you said, TC, you know, I hear people that say, I've never played Catan. And, you know, I think to myself, you don't have to like it. But if you're someone who's broadly interested in the board game hobby, isn't it something you ought to play at least once? You know, it's sort of like saying I'm a fan of music, but I've never listened to Beethoven.
Or like, I like video games. I've never played Pac-Man. Yeah.
So, you know, like,
dangerous territory there, Eric, that you're plumbing around, like what people ought to do.
I agree, but I just think to myself, you know, you don't have to like it, but you ought to play it once.
See, I have a different take on that of there are games that I'm perfectly happy, content in the assumption that I'm unlikely to like them.
Yep.
And if I'm happy with that, then I can let other people be happy with the.
Yeah.
I'm just going to dislike Catan without playing it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, but there are definitely some, like, I mean, if you're like a designer or you talk about games, it's nice to at least be familiar with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It certainly does work its way into many conversations and many podcasts that dedicate themselves to the Hallmark games in collections, and this is certainly one of those.
Yeah, I'm not one of the board gaming press, but I write quite a bit of random stuff on Board Game Geek and other places. And
well, that makes you one of us.
I guess it does.
One of us. One of us.
But, you know, there's a small number of games that I seem to keep bringing up over and over as examples to make points, and Settlers is one of them. You know, there's just so many questions that people might raise about board games where an example from Settlers is a good example to explain things.
Well, as a practical matter, the number of people who have a familiarity with Settlers is so much larger than for most games that you can use,
right,
that it's a very convenient reference,
right,
even if you're talking about something that's not
yep,
particularly close to the game.
It's like a Simpsons quote, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good
anybody
analogy.
Who's been vaguely famous over the last 30 years has been on The Simpsons.
Yep.
That's right. 30 years.
God, I feel so old right now.
30 years.
No. The Simpsons makes me feel young because I watched The Simpsons when I was in college. And so as long as it's on, there's still a TV show that I watched in college.
It's still on. Cool.
They're still showing like the Brady Bunch too.
They are not making new episodes.
New episodes, though. Yeah.
That's true. That's true.
Well, that's gonna wrap up our. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, thanks for inviting us. I just thought that with a show called The Long View, to not have an episode on Settlers, it was just a gaping hole in the repertoire. So glad to help you fill it.
Well,
yeah,
hey,
well, and that would be 4 out of 5 years. That would be 80% the fault of Jeff Gamble. So play the robber on him in your games of Settlers of Catan.
Well, gentlemen, if you see any more gaping holes you want to fill, we would be more happy to have you back.
No. Oh, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much for reaching out and for suggesting this one. This is a landmark episode that needed to be done. We had the right gentleman to take care of it. Nobody could have done it justice like the two of you. The 1846 episode is one that I use as a benchmark in when I try to approach guests because of how useful and how much you opened a world up to somebody who had very little experience with the system at that time and sort of made it accessible. And I think to a certain extent, the accessibility is what you enjoy about Catan. In 1846, you're really having to work hard to make it accessible. You're really having to do a lot on your part, but how much of that has been done by the game is really fantastic. That came across in what you both said, and I really appreciate that you've chosen to share that expertise and that perspective with the Long View.
And we'd love to have you back anytime. An open invitation. Feel free.
You're welcome. Thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Yep. Take care.